Well, thank you for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. As Dr. Hopkamp was saying, one of my lines of research is preference assessments. I was intrigued by the idea of choice and preference working with kids with really significant disabilities. I came through graduate programs where I was in contact with kids who had little to no functional communication. And so they were engaging in really high levels of challenging behavior. They weren't able to express their needs and wants. They were reliant on their caregivers to interpret, sometimes correctly, often incorrectly, what it was they wanted and needed. And so as a doc student, I actually was tasked with this assignment of deciding something to write a lit review on. And I thought, well, okay, I could do this. And so because I was interested in choice and preference, I thought, well, I'll do a lit review on choice and preference. And when I got here, one of my doc students said, I think it's time to write another one. And so he wrote one. And then in the summer, one of my doc students said, I think it's time to take another look at this. So we have 3 lit reviews that I've done either on my own or with my students where we've really been looking at preference assessments. And so what I thought we'd do today was talk about what we know, talk about why do we even need these things, talk about who benefits from their use, and then I thought I would talk a little bit about what we've been studying as a research team, and then talk about what our next steps are, because surprisingly, I was surprised this summer when my doc student did his generals, that he sort of came away with this huge hole in the literature, something that I've been looking at for almost a decade now. And we got to this place and I was like, wow, we are missing this really big piece. So we'll talk about what that is when we get to the end. I will leave time at the end for questions, but if there's like a burning question as we're going, I really don't mind being interrupted, so please interrupt. So these are 2 of our published lit reviews, and really what we were looking at is we did look at choice and preference. So we looked at choice interventions. These were all related to kids who have severe, profound intellectual and developmental disabilities. And specifically related to preference assessments, we wanted to know, do all of these preference assessment formats that are presented in the literature, are they effective at identifying a preference hierarchy, and are the things identified as highly preferred, do they actually function as reinforcers? Because that's really their benefit, right? If we can't use the highly preferred item or activity to change behavior, does it really help us a whole lot? Beyond knowing, for example, if it's an activity, something that, okay, you like that, so now when I need something for you to play with, instead of giving you something that is inappropriate or age inappropriate, I give you something that is appropriate that you might enjoy. But we really look at these as a teaching tool, right? If I know what's going to reinforce your behavior, I can teach you. If I don't know what's going to reinforce your behavior, I can't teach you, right? Or my job is 12 times harder than it would have been if I had something that I knew you liked. So we wanted to know, are these preference assessment formats useful? Do they actually work? We wanted to look at some of the components, so what makes them the same and different. We tried to look at some of the underlying mechanisms of preference, and we actually came away with very little information about how preference works and why it works. That was something my student tackled, and I sort of feel like if we can figure out what you like and what's going to reinforce your behavior, I don't really care why you like it. This is me, the practical person. And then we also looked at the effects of choice on behavior and staff and participant training. So can we teach staff to provide choices? Can we teach staff to use preference assessments? Can we teach participants to make choices? So those are some of the things that we were looking at. And here's basically Thumbup, right? Yes. All of these methodologies can be used to identify reinforcing stimuli for individuals who cannot in some other way tell us what they like. Okay? We can manipulate the kind of impact of preference by changing how much we give, the magnitude of the item, right? So if it's something you really, really like, we can change your behavior much faster. And so most of this stuff is very common sense, right? So we were not surprised by these findings. We found that choice is an effective intervention both at teaching new behaviors and at decreasing challenging behaviors. It can be particularly potent when we have a kid who's engaging in really extreme challenging behavior. we simply add in this antecedent intervention of you get to choose, and suddenly we have these huge changes in behavior. And I would speculate that part of that is that these kids are a group of individuals who are not communicating effectively with us, and all of a sudden we've given them this simple choice that it's incredibly empowering, right? Oh, I don't have to hit you to tell you that I want that thing because you've given me the choice. You've given me an opportunity. And that, shock of all shocks, staff and participants can be taught to make and provide choices, right? So we're going on with that. This is good. So, in a nutshell, individuals who have significant disabilities cannot tell us, I would like today to work for a goldfish. Can't tell us that we can run a systematic preference assessment and figure that out. Okay? And that goldfish, once we figure out that's at the top of the hierarchy, we can use that goldfish to teach new behaviors. And it doesn't have to be food items. It can be activities, it can be stimuli, it can be toys, it can be food, it can be all kinds of different items. Sort of your imagination is the limit here. So why do we need them? Okay? One of the things that I see a lot in school buildings is that 5 years ago, teacher A found this thing that the students seemed to really, really like. Okay? Well, I don't know about you, but 5 years later, you might not like it anymore, right? The Beanie Baby was great when it came out of the package. I'm now 14. Beanie Baby is not really that great anymore, right? I would really like to move on to the 14-year-old toys, or the 18-year-old toys, or the 29-year-old toys. I'm not 7 anymore, right? But we get stuck in this, but I know you like that thing. And I hear that a lot. I know they like it. Okay, and sometimes we see things that are inappropriate, right? I've gone into classrooms where a child is playing with a piece of string, and I think, okay, could we make that functional in any way functional? And I get these responses, well, but that's what they like. Okay, let's think outside of the box here. Like, what could we do with string? Could we get a string toy? Could we teach them how to knit? I mean, like anything. But, it's just playing with string. And so we get stuck in these ruts of, I found that thing, that one thing that the student latched onto. I'm going to use it forever. And so, over time, that thing is going to lose its effectiveness as a reinforcer because you always have access to it, right? It's not contingently given, it's free access often. And so we are losing power as instructors because we're not identifying new things, right? What we know about teaching kids who have significant disabilities is that the more variety we have in the things we use to reinforce their behavior, the more effective we are in our instruction. Okay, we're going to teach faster, and we're going to teach more if we're using a variety of reinforcers. Okay? People often ask me, why don't you just ask somebody, right? If someone wanted to know what I liked, they would come up to me and they would say, hey, Helen, what do you like? And I would tell you. And you might give me a class. What kind of foods do you like? What kind of activities do you like? What kind of toys do you like? And I could answer you, right? We go to a kid who has a significant disability, and we say, what do you like? And they go, okay, well, give me something. Okay, but if we haven't taught them to communicate, they can't tell us, right? They don't have that ability yet because we haven't taught them how to tell us what it is they want. So because of that, we assume that the people who are around them the most know what they like. There's a flaw in that assumption. The assumption is that because you spend so much time with this person, you've given them access to hundreds of different things. And so you know of those hundreds of different things, the things that they attach to. Okay? Having talked to some parents, it's not that simple, right? There's a desperation of what, I don't know what he or she likes. I just try anything, but I don't know. Okay? So then we come in, like, so,
tell me, what is your child like? And I know lots of parents who are like, I'm going to just tell you what I think, okay? I don't have any evidence necessarily that what I'm saying is right. I'm going with my gut. Or we have people say, I have no idea, okay? Here's what we know. When we get reports of preference from people close to a student, 50% of the time they're wrong, okay? If we put those things into a direct preference assessment and we test it, 50% of the time, it's not reinforcing. It's not something that pops up as highly preferred, okay? It's really sad, because that means that on chance, 50-50, they're gonna tell us something that we can use to reinforce behavior, okay? So the 50% of the time that they're wrong, we're gonna use instructional strategies to try and teach them, and then we're gonna reinforce them with something that they don't like, that's not reinforcing. So the behavior's not gonna go up. So we're going to feel like, okay, well, they don't like this thing. But we haven't made any progress, okay? That can be incredibly discouraging to families and teachers, that you ask, you try and find out, and they're wrong, okay? The other problem with this, and this is something that is not necessarily solved by preference assessments, but that people forget the idiosyncratic things, okay? So this is a little girl who likes lemons. This is the face I make when I eat lemons. Right? I don't like them. They make my mouth hurt, make my mouth water. I would prefer not to eat a raw lemon. My daughter, on the other hand, you give her a raw lemon and she's like, this is so great, can I have more? Right? There's no puckering, there's no salivating. She's like happy as can be with raw lemon. Right? My husband is the same way. They'll just eat them like oranges. Right? And I'm like, that is just wrong. Right? But we have kids who like these kinds of things, right? And if nobody suggests it to us, we may not think to test it, to even think about it, okay? So when we think about preference assessments, even if we get some good information from families and teachers, we always want to try and add in a couple things that we're like, what might the student like? Okay, so here are some other examples. A couple years ago, we were doing a study, and I'll show you some data from some new participants, but we were having the darndest time trying to figure out what this person liked. And one day my doc student fell over. She tripped. And the student was laughing, hysterically. We had never seen laughter from this student, ever, right? We always saw kind of grins when we showed up. She seemed perfectly content that we were there, but never giggling hysterically, right? She was like a little schoolgirl. And so my student waited a few minutes and then she fell over again. She loved it, okay? So we were like, okay, so we made a little stick figure and it fell over. And most powerful reinforcer for this student. And we were like, okay, well that was accidental. We had no idea. Sneezes. Okay, we were working a couple years ago and one of my students sneezed. And the student who would typically not look up looked immediately to my master's student, looked at my master's student, held his gaze for several seconds, and so we're like, okay, so now I have a picture in my office of my master's student sneezing. It's not a pretty picture, but the student selected it every single time it was an option, okay? And every time we tested it as a reinforcer, he would respond higher than when we didn't use it, okay? Those are idiosyncratic, right? How many of you would work for sneezes, right? Falling over, watching someone fall over, right? I wouldn't, maybe. So we really have to think about, and we're really challenged in preference assessments to find those things that are a little odd. And if we have any inkling that it might be a preferred item, that we add it in, even if someone might look at us like we're a little crazy, right? Because we can shape those behaviors up, right? I'm going to take a step back here and comment that falling over and sneezing are not necessarily a whole lot better than a piece of string, right? But if we've had nothing at all and we found something, I can take that thing and I can shape some new behaviors and I can teach you some communicative responses. And then once I've got that communication in place, I don't necessarily need the sneezing anymore, because now you've got some communication and I can give you some other options and you can select from those options, right? So if we start with something that seems sort of odd, I would say run with it, but you got to get away from it because you can't be in a grocery store or at a restaurant. So put your order in, and then sneeze to reinforce the ordering. Right? People in the community are like, what is happening over there? Right? We try and avoid that response when we're in the community. Okay? So just a aside there. So who benefits? Okay? When we do preference assessments, the real answer is everybody benefits, but most importantly, the student benefits. Okay? If we are going to use good instructional programming with students who have significant disabilities, we have to have good reinforcers, because our instructional technologies are only as good as the things we're using to reinforce the behavior. Okay? From the teaching perspective and a staff perspective or a clinical perspective, I know that I feel better at the end of the day when my data show me that what I did worked. Right? I always feel better. I do not like the days when I leave and I'm like, we didn't make any progress. Those are not my happy days. Right? I'm like, okay, what are we going to do differently? I feel great when I leave a session and I know that my student has made progress from the day before. And part of that is the instruction, and part of that is the reinforcers. So when I go in and talk to teachers, I say, well, how much progress is the student making? And I say, well, not really any at all. Right? What happens to expectations? They go up or down? Down, right? So a teacher who every single day goes in and tries something and it doesn't work, and then tries something the next day and it doesn't work. Suddenly it's not about my teaching, right? They're not learning because I'm not teaching well enough. There becomes a shift, and the shift is they're not learning because they can't. And they're not learning because their disability is too significant. Right? And I hear that a lot. I go into classrooms at the beginning of the year and I say, we're doing this research study, we'd like to teach this skill, and teachers will look at me like, I have 3 hits. They're like, you are out of your mind if you think by the end of the year the student is going to acquire this skill. And usually that for me is like a kick in the pants. I'm like, okay, right? Which is sort of snotty, but it's like my inside response. I'm like, bring it on, people. And sure enough, by the end of the year, we've taught the students. It may be slow, but every time we get that response, we are successful in teaching those students something, right? We don't conquer the world, but I'm not out to conquer the world in the year. I'm out to teach you something, anything, to make you a more included citizen, right? And so if we can get teachers to a place where their students are making strides, even if they're small ones, their expectations aren't going to go down as much. And they're going to work harder to keep their students learning. Right? So the benefit of using this technology is extreme, even though it's something that's really, really simple. Okay? These are not hard to implement. They're really straightforward. They don't take a ton of time. So for something so simple to be so powerful, I think it's something we need to always keep in mind. Okay? So here's just a couple of studies we've been working on. We have other studies that we've done. And I'll go through each of them. 2 of them use an MSWO, which is the multiple stimulus without replacement assessment, which I'll talk about in a second. And really we wanted to look at, can we make it shorter? Everybody always wants to know, how fast can I do this? And then we wanted to look at, our preferences stable over time. Right? And then we also work with some kids who they don't communicate, and have significant physical impairments. Okay? So in all of the preference assessments prior to us starting this research, the expectation was that someone would reach out and select either from 1 thing, 2 things, 5 things, but there was always this key of you have to reach out and select. So we thought, okay, well, what if they can't? How do they tell us what they want if they can't actually reach out and make that selection? So we wanted to see, could we use eye gaze to get the same results? Okay, so we'll walk through each of these studies. So in the first one, traditionally the way that the MSWO is run is that you do 5 trials across 5 sessions. Okay, so in each session you would do 5 trials. So you end up with 25 trials. And you basically take the averages of selection, in what order did they select these items, and it gives you an average rank ordering. Okay, so the way this assessment works is you would lay out an array. Usually it's 5 to 6, but it could be up to 12. You lay out this array, you say pick one, the student takes one, they play with it, they eat it, whatever. You rearrange the array, you lay it out again, you say pick one, and you just carry on
until all of the items have been selected or the student stops responding. Okay, very simple. Okay, and the average duration is about 25 minutes, not super long. Okay. One question that we came up with was, okay, well, what if we did this in one session with one trial? Right? We sit down and we say, here's your array, choose, and they choose from the items. We take that single rank ordering. Does that identify a good rank in which the top ranked item actually serves as a reinforcer? I know we wanted to know, are there differences that are going to affect our conclusions? Okay. So this was something that one of my doc students took on because he thought 25 minutes was too long. And so we had 3 participants, ages 18 to 21. They all had either a developmental disability, intellectual disability, one had cerebral palsy. They were pointing or guiding their caregivers to the things that they wanted or needed. We ran 3 phases. We did a 5 trial assessment. So these are all single session assessments. We did 5 trials where we would present the entire array 5 times. 3 trials where we would do the entire array 3 times, and 1 trial where we would take the array and present it once and choose all the items. Each of those assessments was followed by a reinforcer assessment. The function of a reinforcer assessment from a research standpoint is to figure out, are these things that we identified as high preference, will they increase the likelihood that a student will engage in a particular behavior if the consequence for engaging that behavior is the high preference item? Okay. I would argue, this is another aside, soapbox thing, a lot of times I have students say to me, we should be having teachers run reinforcer assessments, right? And my general response to that is, if we as researchers can't figure out whether these things work or not, why does the teacher have to do our work for us? So when I teach teachers how to do this, I only make them do the preference assessment, and clinicians only do the preference assessment, because as researchers, we should be the ones figuring out whether these work or not, right? A teacher shouldn't have to conduct a reinforcer assessment to find out, is this actually going to work or not? Okay, so in all of these studies, we have a reinforcer assessment, but I think that that lands on us. So from a clinical perspective, the output of all of these studies should be, how do you do the preference assessment and does it work? And from a clinical perspective, that should be all that a clinician or a teacher has to do in their space. Okay? So the reinforcer assessment is something that researchers really need to be honing in on to make sure that the preference assessments we're recommending do what we say that they do. Okay. We used across the reinforcer assessments, we used different color switches and voice output. And so what we would do in baseline, if they pressed the switch, there was no output because they wouldn't get a consequence. In the high preference condition, if they pressed the switch, it would say, I want, and then whatever the high preference item was. And then in the low preference condition, they would press the switch and it would say whatever the low preference thing was. To say, I want whatever the low preference thing was. And we used different colors. And we did that in the hopes that the students would differentiate the conditions. Okay. We looked at switch activation was the skill that we used in the reinforcer assessment. So if they pressed the switch, we counted that as a response. In baseline, since there was no voice output to listen for, it was, the switch is like a Big Mac. When you click it, it actually clicks. And so if we heard it click, we said that they had made a selection. And we did all of this research in an unoccupied classroom at the student's school. So for Tony, here is his highly preferred and least preferred item across the different trials, since we're all food things. What you should notice is that across these 3 conditions, the only time that the high preference matched was in the 5 trial and the single trial. Okay, so in 3 trial we got a different high preference item, but the array was the same across all the preference assessments. Okay. And then the low preference item shifted across all 3 different assessments. So then if we look at his reinforcer assessment results, he did not mind hitting the switch and getting nothing for it. And so we ran until he finally stopped responding, right? So we basically had to extinguish this behavior, which I have to tell you as a researcher is really hard, like emotionally difficult, because you're like, oh, you're responding, I want to change that. I want to teach and get you responding more. But, relax, we have to wait until did this nosedive over here. But as soon as we put the high preference piece in place, so this is after the 5 trial MSWS, this was the M&M. His switch would say, I want an M&M, he got an M&M, he started responding very quickly. The low preference was, I can't remember, but when we had that one, it dropped back to baseline, it went down right away. He learned very quickly that when it doesn't say anything, I don't get anything, so I'm not going to work. And then we put the high preference thing back in place, and he responded at high levels. Okay, so 5 trials works just fine. Okay. Oddly, he did not remember when we got to the next reinforcer assessment that if it says nothing, you get nothing. So he's just happily, merrily pressing the switch that clicked. So there might have been, what you take away from that is that maybe there's something about the click that was reinforcing to him, right? It's like, ooh, this is kind of fun. And there's probably also I love all of my doc students dearly, but they don't all have the flat affect mastered. So there's a pretty good likelihood that my doc student was probably like, oh gosh, stop, Which might also have been reinforcing, right? So the student is like, ooh, look at that reaction, right? So I wasn't there. I don't know how he responded, but I know this doc student well, so that's a possibility here. Just saying, just being honest. But again, we put the high preference item in place. This is the 3 trial, so we had this was the drink, right? So it's a different high preference item, also worked, okay? We put the low preference item in place, and it took a while for his behavior to go down. So suggesting that something about, I think it was an animal cracker in this case, something about the animal cracker was sort of reinforcing. It just wasn't as powerful as the high preference item. Back in baseline, happy as could be to just keep clicking away. And then we put the high P back in place, and he started responding very high, very stable. Okay. So what we see from this is there's something about baseline that's reinforcing. Otherwise, it would have extinguished very quickly. It didn't. The high preference item is clearly reinforcing, but there's something about this low preference item that is somewhat reinforcing. Okay? And we can take this information and say, okay, well, maybe we can use those for skills that are in mastery. We're just testing maintenance. We're going to use something that is kind of like, right? So that we're not wasting all of our power with the high preference items on something that we're just trying to maintain. Okay? And then here's the last reinforcer assessment. This is the single trial. Okay, again, here we have baseline. No consequence except clicking. So eventually it extinguished. High preference, but look at that low preference, right? Anything worked for him, apparently. We go back to baseline, we have this immediate drop off, and then low preference and high preference both were equally effective as reinforcers. Okay? So for this participant, it didn't really matter how many trials we ran in the assessment. The thing that came out as high preference did function as a reinforcer. The things that were somewhat surprising is that in baseline, he continued responding. Okay? So by the time we get to this graph, we've run 2 reinforcer assessments where the same consequences available in baseline, which is nothing except the click. Okay? So something about that is carrying over. We did not go into much depth analyzing that. Okay? This is K. With K, we only got enough information on the 5 trial assessment to actually create a rank. And the reason that is that when we ran the 3 trial and the single trial, she simply stopped responding. She's like, I don't want to. So for her, we thought, well, let's just run it out and see if this 5 trial assessment actually identified reinforcers. Oddly, this whole baseline thing, right? High levels of responding, dropping down. High preference, it worked. Low preference, it worked for a little bit, and then it stopped. Baseline has this other increase in behavior, and then it drops off. And then back to the high preference, where we have high levels of responding. So we identified a reinforcer as the high P item. Okay. Then for Jill, only in the 3 trials she wouldn't respond, and so we didn't get enough information. Okay, but we were able to complete the 5 trial and the single trial, and there's no crossover in these and what the items identified as high preference and low preference were. Okay. And here we have a little bit of a mess. Okay. Throw some data points up and see where they land. Sort of how we felt every day we left with these sessions. So baseline, we have this sharp decreasing trend. So she figured out pretty quickly, I'm not getting anything in baseline. We put the high preference item in play. So this is with the 5 trial assessment. And she was like, yeah, it's all right. I'm a favorite. I don't really want to press the switch enough, right? This is a low effort response. This is not like we're asking her to do something difficult. We put the low P item in place. She didn't respond at all. We went back to baseline. We had no responding. We go back to the high preference. And eventually we get high levels of responding. But I would argue that this is probably not the most potent reinforcer for this student. Okay. And then here we have the single trial, right? Remember, we had different items, and yeah, pretty much nothing worked. Okay. So what can we say about this? And I'm going to tell you that this is what we wrote, and then there's some other pieces. Okay. This was a good extension on previous research. Okay. It does give us some more information. What it doesn't do is we did not take the time to go figure out what the heck was going on in baseline with that really high responding, right? Who keeps responding when you get nothing, right? So what about that? What was in the environment that was reinforcing? If we could have figured it out, we could have added it into a preference assessment and tested it, right? Do you actually like the click? If you do, ta-da, we've got your reinforcer, okay? We didn't take the time to go and look into that. And some of this is 20/20 hindsight. You know, you take a break from your data for like a year and you come back and you're like, oh, why didn't we ask that question? But we didn't. And we got some support for one participant of the use of these briefer assessments, right? So imagine if you're a teacher, right, you come into class and you have 3 minutes to run an assessment. You're like, okay, I'm going to just run 3 trials real quick and I'm going to figure out, you know, what's the average high preference thing, and we're going to use that today. Okay, that has a lot of potential power practically. Okay. But only if we can verify that consistently, when you do that, you're going to get good results. But I would argue that a single 5 trial session is probably going to take you, what, 5 to 7 minutes? That's not a huge time sink, right? So if you wanted to start your day and say, I'm going to figure out what you're going to work for today, we're going to take 7 minutes at the beginning of the day and do this, I would argue that we have good data from this data set that the 5 trial assessment was effective every time we did it. Okay? So then we started thinking about, okay, well, there are a couple studies that have looked at the stability of preference over time. And what they've done is they take 1 point at the beginning of the year, and then 1 point 6 months later, and 12 months later, or just 12 months later. Okay, so this is a big span of time between the 2 assessments. And so we thought, okay, well, what happens if you test every 2 weeks? And then what happens if you separate out food and activities? And so what we did is we ran every 2 weeks, we ran a traditional MSWO, which is 5 trials across 5 sessions, so 25 trials. Every 2 weeks, we did 5 food items and 5 activities. Okay? And we just wanted to see how stable these were. We had 5 students with severe or profound disabilities. And what we did is if they weren't available at the 2-week mark, we waited until the first day they were available, and then we waited 2 weeks from that point. So between some sessions, we had 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks. So it was variable depending on the student's availability. And we simply rank ordered each group edible activities. Okay? We did not run reinforcer assessments. We simply wanted to know what happened to the rank orders. And this is essentially what we found with all of our participants. So I'm only going to show this one graph. This is a food graph for one of our participants. And here's essentially what we found. These are where it ranked. Okay? But the high preference things, there was not a big shift, right? So it stayed at the top 1 to 2. Where the shift happened was here at the low preference items. Sometimes they were number 3, sometimes they were number 5, sometimes they were 4. That's where the shift was. And so what we took away from this is, okay, if we can identify the top 2 items, I can give you a choice between those 2 items. They're going to be pretty stable, okay? And I'm going to just disregard the stuff at the low end of the hierarchy, okay? There is some data to support that moderate and low preference items can serve as reinforcers for low effort skills, okay? But really, if I'm going to go into this and I'm going to think, okay, I have one opportunity to do a really solid preference assessment. I'm going to do it once. I'm going to take these top couple of things and I'm going to run with them, okay? Best practice would probably suggest that it's a good idea to run a preference assessment more often than once a year, right? So I have here just a note to remind myself the difference between choice and preference, right? Choice is your act of selecting something. Preference is sort of how I feel about that thing in the moment, right? But my choice is the act of choosing the thing I prefer, okay? So whenever I talk about preference assessments and how often you need to do them, I tell people to think about your own behavior, okay? So I don't do this anymore, but I used to go to Subway for lunch and I would order the exact same thing every single time I went, and that's just what I ate, right? Very rarely would I go in and be like, okay, I don't really want turkey today, so I'm gonna have tuna. Not very often. It's like on a whim at that moment. I think about my behavior now, and I have high levels of variability in the things that I choose, okay? So if my choices shift, my preferences shift, I have the power to choose what I want. If I today decide that I would rather have M&Ms than a Snickers bar, I'm gonna go get M&Ms, right? And that choice is my act of expressing my preference. When we're working with students who have significant disabilities and they're not communicating with us frequently, we need to not forget that the act of choosing is probably significantly more empowering to that person than knowing the things that they like. And you arbitrarily choosing, well, you indicated in September last year that you liked this thing, so I'm going to give it to you every single time, okay? So just be aware that when we use preference assessments, we're trying to figure out a hierarchy. Beyond that, we're trying to figure out, can you make choices? How do you make choices? And completely separate from the preference assessment, how do I build that into your programming so that I'm giving you the option to choose? So let's say that I'm running an instructional session. There's not any reason I can't take 2 items, your top 2 items, and let you choose from them, right? Because maybe today you like preferred item number 2 more than you like preferred item number 1, right? And maybe that's because you spent all morning with preferred item 1 and you're tired of it, so you'd like to shift. So when we think about preferences and stability, we can't just take this data which suggests that their preferences are stable and assume that they don't ever shift, or that on day to day they might prefer something slightly different. We do, so they probably do too, right? Just a note of caution. Okay, so let's shift gears from the MSWO, which is physical selection from an array of items. It's our most efficient preference assessment that has a really solid data background. And shift to those kids who are not able physically to select from an array. Can't do it, right? We started looking at this group of kids, and the teachers were generally saying, we have no idea what they like. None. They don't tell us. They have no words. They're not communicating. They don't have a communication system in place. So if they lack the physical capability to select from an array, how do we identify reinforcers for them? And so we thought, okay, let's see if they can look. We give them 2 choices, can they look? And give us information, enough information to come up with a hierarchy. So in 2010, we did a study And this was the first time we did this, and we used a paired choice preference assessment. And what that one is you have a group of items, you pair each item with every other item, and you present each pair. And you simply look at which things were selected most. Okay? So with eye gaze, what we said is, okay, we're going to give you this pair, but instead of you reaching out and choosing one, you have to look at it and you have to maintain your eye gaze for 2 seconds. Does that give us the same information? What we found is that yes, it does. They were selecting items using eye gaze, and that those items effectively worked in a reinforcer assessment. What we didn't do in that study is we didn't collect any data on duration, so we didn't know how long this actually took us. And when we looked at our reinforcer assessment, we got some complaints back from reviewers saying, well, you know, why are your condition lengths so variable? So we tried to control for that. So we did this again. We replicated the study. We did exactly the same thing. But we measured for duration, and we measured for the lengths in the reinforcer assessment of the conditions. We had 3 participants. All had severe intellectual disabilities, and none of them were able to reach out and select stimuli. We talked to their teachers and staff to figure out what kinds of things they might like, and we sent home this survey. It's called the Reinforcer Assessment for Individuals with Severe Disabilities. And if you've never seen this survey, what it does is it breaks out into categories. So what are some things that the student likes to eat? What are some things that the student likes to smell? Are there visual stimuli that the student seems to like? Are there tactile stimuli? And so in each of these categories, the respondents tell you what are some things that they think the person likes in those categories. Okay? We always use this survey as a way to gather an array of items to test in a preference assessment. And so just like in the previous studies, things that were identified as high preference and low preference, meaning that things that were chosen the most and the least, we tested in a reinforcer assessment. So here were the things that we looked at. We had a pretty big variety with this group. And the brushes were actually for brushing their hair, not their bodies. I'm trying to think if there are any others that were. So some of these are not super appropriate, but we went with it. Okay. So for Joan, she liked book and having her hair brushed. And so whenever we get into brushing things like this, or having a book read, there's always a potential like positive reinforcement from the person component, and we didn't break that out here. But we figured if her most highly preferred item or activity was having her hair brushed, whether it was the person or the brushing didn't really matter. We were going to consider that as one thing. Victor liked a squishy sun, which is just, you know, like a stress ball kind of thing, and music. And John also liked the squishy ball. His was not a slime, so his didn't have like things coming off of it, and music. Okay? And so what we would do is we would simply hold up these 2 items. Actually, I can take it to the next slide. Here we go. We would hold up the 2 items at eye level. And so for some of our participants, that meant eye level. Some of them that meant eye level. Right? It was wherever their natural neutral gaze was. So we didn't require a center line. You know, have to look in the middle, because some of these participants were sitting, you know, they're all in wheelchairs. Some of them are sitting like this. And so neutral gaze is that way. So we did not try and force something to be like, okay, you sit up straight and look forward. Okay? So we went with what they needed. We would hold up the 2 items and we would name them both. So for Joan, it was, let's just say brush and squishy ball, right? We'd say brush, squishy ball, and then we would take the brush, we'd take the squishy ball away, we'd take the brush and we'd brush her hair. And then we would take that away, we'd shut the squishy ball, and we'd put it up to her hand so that she could squish it if she wanted to. And then we would hold them both back up again, and we would say, pick one. And we would wait for them to look at one of the items and hold that gaze for 2 seconds. Okay? If they didn't choose one within 5 seconds, we took them both away, waited 2 seconds, we represented them, and we said, pick one. Okay? If they didn't make a choice after that, we terminated that trial. With Victor, he did not hold a gaze for 2 seconds on anything. So we reduced his to 10 seconds, and we gave him to 1 second, and we gave him 10 seconds to initiate a look. Okay? So one of the biggest challenges with this assessment is that kids who are have significant physical disabilities, we have to be so cognizant of how long it takes them to respond. Okay, we have to give them that opportunity. So for all of these participants, it took us, we probably spent, I don't know, a good week just talking to them, hanging out, bringing in games, seeing where they were looking, how long they were looking at things. And so for Victor, his eyes would actually waver. But when he liked something, his eyes would actually settle very briefly on the thing, and then he would look away. And his eyes would start wavering again. Okay, but we could see a clear selection, what we felt was a clear selection, so we tested it. And we talked about all those pieces. So in this one we did 30 pairings. And then in the reinforcer assessment, we ran baseline, low preference, and high preference conditions. And we set our high preference and low preference conditions to 5 sessions each condition. Okay? And the reason that we did that is that we weren't actually trying to gain experimental control. Right? We're not trying to demonstrate that this thing is going to effectively change behavior. What we really wanted to see is, one of the complaints that we've gotten in the past is, well, if you run a high preference condition out for 15 sessions and the student responding eventually increases, and then you run a low preference condition for 5 sessions and their behavior drops a little bit, well, what if you kept going for 15 sessions? Would it eventually rise again? So we thought, well, we're just going to control for that. 5 sessions, right? We're simply testing the effectiveness of these items over prescriptive numbers of sessions. And so here's what we found. These are Jones data, right? And baseline, it's all got shifted by 1. Okay, so this is baseline. Low levels of responding. We gave her access to the low preference item. We had some more responding, but a slight decrease. High preference in place, we had high levels. So we could be back to baseline, and then low preference, high preference, low preference. Sorry that the labels got shifted. Okay, so what we see in the low preference is this kind of fairly flat trend here, and with a high preference, we have a higher trend. Okay. And what we had them do in the reinforcer assessment was look at the researcher. Okay, so we would say, if you want X, look at me. And they were expected to look at the researcher for either 2 seconds or 1 second, depending on the participant. These are the data for Victor. Baseline, high preference, we start to see some responding. We put the low preference item in place, the responding goes away. Same thing in baseline. High preference, we have some variability. Go back to low preference, he's not responding. And then in that last high preference session, we start seeing some more behavior. And then finally for John, we really only saw responding when we gave him access to the high preference item. Okay, so now remember when we look at these data that these are kids who, when we ask their teacher what are they doing during the day, they say, well, not really a whole lot. Okay, so they didn't really believe that they would respond at all when we started, and so we were like, yes, they looked at us, right? It's not a big thing, but still, I'm controlling that behavior because I'm asking you to do something, you did it, I gave you the reinforcer, you're engaging that behavior more, okay? That means that I can teach you. It means I have access to teaching you, okay? So these results were consistent with what we found in the first study that we did with eye gaze. The total duration was an average of 155 minutes, or just over 2.5 hours. So I'm gonna point this out. A lot of people say, well, that's not efficient, okay? But for someone who cannot physically reach out and select something, I would say 2.5 hours is like nothing if that gives me access to teaching you new skills. Okay? So the efficiency comes into place that this didn't take me weeks. This didn't take me 40 hours. 2.5 hours, we usually spread this out over a week or 2 just so we didn't get fatigue. But I would argue that if I have a whole year and I spend 2.5 hours and find some things that you like, I'm going to spend that 2.5 hours and not think twice about it. Okay? Here's our biggest limitation, is that we did not test a skill in acquisition, okay? We already knew they could look because they selected the items by looking, right? So all we were testing was, would you look at me more if I gave you the reinforcer or not? And we had an effect, okay? But this really gets us to where we're at next. I told you at the beginning that one of my doc students did generals this summer, and what he looked at in the preference assessment literature was how often were we testing a skill in acquisition in the reinforcer assessment, and what were our schedules of reinforcement, and big gaping hole. We almost never test skills that are in acquisition. We almost always are testing skills that the student already has. Okay? Whether they're in mastery or not, there's some indication that the student has that skill already. Okay? That is a really big problem. Because if I'm going to a teacher and saying, you run this preference assessment, use the high preferred item, the highly preferred item, and you'll be able to teach new skills, I don't actually know that. So I'm sort of fudging it. And I didn't even think about that until he did his generals, and that's what he found. And I was like, okay, so I've sort of been lying for like the last 10 years. Great, right? The other piece that was sort of shocking is that in these reinforcer assessments, we're using an FR1 schedule, meaning that every single time a student responded, we reinforce them. How many times does that happen in a classroom? Right? It doesn't. Natural schedules of reinforcement are not continuous. They just aren't. Right? Every 5th response, every 4th response, every 10th response, right? If you're in a really low reinforcing environment, maybe every 50th response, once every half hour, right? So we're going to have the same effects if we are using natural schedules of reinforcement, even if we fade to that, right? So we do have some studies that look at progressive ratio schedules where we're sort of looking for the breaking point, right? At what point is this reinforcer not going to work anymore? There's a couple of studies that have looked at that, but not very many, okay? So we have some work to do. And so one of the things that we're actually doing this year is we're going to replicate the IDD study, and we're actually going to take a skill that's in acquisition. We're going to take a skill that we know they don't have, that's an IEP goal, and we're going to see if we can teach it using the items that we identified as highly preferred. And I think that's going to be either it's going to be really great where it works and everything we've said for the last 40 years is right, or it's not going to work and we're going to have to go exploring why isn't it working, right? And so that's where we're at. I think probably in the next couple of years we'll do some studies looking at natural schedules of reinforcement. We don't have that on the books this year. We're sort of full up. But we're definitely going to start looking at this. Can we teach new skills? Because I think that's what teachers want, right? I had to teach something new. Will these reinforcers work or not? So that's what I have. Any questions?
We have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah.
I'm curious if there are any purpose assessment measures that have been utilized with individuals who also have visual impairments.
I've done them with students with visual impairments, and we just rely on tactile, right? So in most preference assessments, you'll give a sampling time where you'll let them sample each item. And so with students who are visually impaired, we simply put it in their hands and we help them to manipulate, like, what does this thing do? And with the students that I've worked with, it's been effective. We've identified reinforcers.